9 experienced hikers went into the northern Urals in the winter of 1959. Only one came back alive, and that was only because he turned around early. The other 9 never made it home, and what searchers found on that mountain would become one of the most haunting mysteries of the 20th century. Their tent was found ripped open from the inside. Their boots were still there. Their warm clothes were still there. And yet, in the middle of a lethal mountain night, the group had run out into the snow as if staying inside for even one more second felt worse than freezing to death. For decades, people blamed everything from secret weapons tests to a Yeti. But the real story is darker than a monster tale, because it begins with something much harder to shake off: a real group of young people, a brutal landscape, and one night that seems to break apart in the evidence. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. With him were Zinaida Kalmogorova, Ludmila Dubinina, Rustam Slobodin, Georgy Krivonischenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and the older, more experienced Semyon Zolotaryov. There had been 10 at the start. The 10th was Yuri Yudin. A few days into the expedition, pain in his leg and back forced him to turn around. That decision saved his life, and it condemned him to spend the rest of it wondering what happened to his friends after he left them on the trail. This matters, because these were not reckless amateurs walking into the wilderness blind. They were experienced trekkers on a high-difficulty winter route. That is one reason the case has always felt wrong. When trained people do something that looks irrational, the question becomes immediate: what frightened them enough to break their own survival logic? Their destination was Mount Otorten. They left Sverdlovsk in late January, moved through the last inhabited settlements, and pushed north into the kind of terrain where distance, cold, and wind can turn a small error into a fatal chain reaction. At first, nothing about the expedition looked unusual. Because cameras and diaries were recovered, the Dyatlov Pass case has something many old mysteries do not: a visible lead-up. We can actually watch the expedition moving deeper into the mountains. There are smiles, routine camp tasks, skis, snow, and the ordinary rhythm of people who still believe they are on a hard but manageable trip. On January 31st, the group reached the edge of the highland zone and cached supplies for the return journey. The next day, they moved toward the pass. At some point on the slope of Kholat Syakhl, they pitched their tent high on open ground instead of descending into the shelter of the forest. That choice has been debated ever since. Did they lose visibility and camp where they were forced to stop? Did they deliberately choose the slope to make up time the next morning? Or did they think the terrain above them was stable enough? Every theory begins at that tent site, because that is where the final normal decision seems to end. One of the last photographs appears to show the group working on that snowy incline before nightfall. It is one of the most chilling images in mystery history, not because it shows danger clearly, but because it shows none at all. Everything still looks recoverable. Everything still looks ordinary. Then the record ends. Sometime after midnight, something happened that drove all 9 people out of that tent and down the mountain. The mystery is not that they died in terrible conditions. The mystery is what made them leave before the mountain finished the job. Dyatlov had told his sports club to expect a message when the group returned. When no message came, people did not panic at once. Delays were common on winter expeditions. But by February 20th, concern was serious enough that a search began. On February 26th, the search party found the tent. It was half collapsed and covered in snow. Inside were boots, clothing, and personal items that should never have been left behind. Food was still there. The cut in the fabric appeared to have been made from the inside. That is the first great fracture in the logic of the case. If they were escaping a threat, why did they not take more clothing? If they expected to return in minutes, what was so urgent that they cut through the tent wall instead of using the entrance? And if this was panic, why do many later details suggest the group still tried to organize itself after leaving? Investigators also found tracks leading away from the tent toward the forest. Not the scattered chaos you might imagine from a blind stampede, but evidence that at least some members moved downslope together. That single detail changed the shape of the mystery. They did not simply explode into disorder. They made decisions after leaving. At the forest edge, under a cedar tree, searchers found Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko. They were underdressed, barefoot or nearly barefoot, and beside the remains of a fire. Branches above them were broken high up the tree, suggesting that someone had climbed it, perhaps to look back toward the tent. That image is devastating because it suggests survival behavior, not myth. A fire means intent. Climbing the tree means visibility mattered. These were not people surrendering to confusion in the first instant. They were trying to understand where they were, where the tent was, and whether going back was still possible. Farther upslope, searchers found Igor Dyatlov, then Zinaida Kolmogorova, then Rustam Slobodin. Their positions suggested they were trying to make their way back to the tent. That means the group had likely split, and that split may be the key to the whole case. Not everyone was doing the same thing anymore. This arrangement of the bodies tells a grim story. 2 stayed near the cedar fire. 3 tried to return uphill. That already feels like a desperate but rational pattern: hold on, regroup, recover supplies, survive the night. But the remaining 4 were still missing, and when they were finally found, the case became stranger than ever. The last 4 bodies were not discovered until May, after the snow began to thaw. They were found in a ravine area associated with what appeared to be a den or snow shelter. Those 4 were Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Ludmila Dubinina. Unlike the first 5, several of these victims had catastrophic internal injuries. Thibault-Brignol had a severe skull fracture. Zolotaryov and Dubinina had crushing chest trauma. And yet the bodies did not show the kind of extensive external damage many people would expect from a savage attack. There were details that fed the legend for decades. Dubinina was missing her tongue. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had empty eye sockets. To the public, that sounded monstrous. But in a harsh outdoor environment, with bodies exposed for months in snow, water, and animal activity, some of those details may be less supernatural than they first appear. Still, one question refused to go away. How did some members die of exposure while others suffered massive trauma? If a single event drove them from the tent, why do the deaths look like different endings to different stories? This is the point where the Dyatlov Pass incident stops feeling like one mystery and starts feeling like several. The original Soviet investigation concluded that no crime had been proved and that the group died because of a so-called compelling natural force. That phrase did not solve the case. It only gave the mystery a permanent shape. It sounded official, vague, and unfinished all at once. Once the case entered public imagination, theories multiplied fast. Secret weapons tests. Parachute mines. A military cover-up. Ball lightning. A Yeti. Some pointed to reported glowing objects in the sky. Others focused on traces of radiation found on some clothing and treated that detail as proof that the state was hiding something catastrophic. The radiation detail sounds explosive until you look closer. Georgy Krivonischenko had worked at the Mayak-associated Kishtim cleanup zone after the 1957 nuclear disaster, and Alexander Kolevatov had also worked in the Soviet nuclear sphere. In other words, contaminated clothing does not automatically point to a secret attack on the mountain. That does not mean every strange detail is easy to dismiss. It means the case became famous partly because each fragment seemed to belong to a different explanation. The tent suggested sudden flight. The cedar fire suggested regrouping. The ravine injuries suggested crushing force. The delayed recovery of the bodies let every gap fill itself with legend. And that is why the Dyatlov Pass incident endured when so many cold cases faded. It was not just unsolved. It was dramatically unsolved. Every piece of evidence seemed to invite a different story, and almost none of those stories could explain everything at once. In 2019, Russian prosecutors reopened the case and focused on natural explanations. In 2020, they announced that an avalanche was the cause. More specifically, the argument leaned toward a small snow slab event that forced the hikers to leave the tent in low visibility and extreme cold, after which they failed to find their way back. For many people, that sounded unsatisfying. The slope above the tent did not look like a classic avalanche slope. Searchers had not reported a giant debris field. And the severe injuries had long been used as arguments against avalanche theory. So the official answer did not end the debate. It only moved it. Then, in 2021, two researchers published a peer-reviewed model arguing that a delayed slab avalanche was physically plausible. Their idea was not that a giant roaring wall of snow smashed the camp. It was that the group may have cut into the slope to place the tent, and that wind-loaded snow above them later released after a delay. That matters because a smaller slab could fit the strange evidence better than the old image of a massive avalanche. It could explain why the tent area did not look obliterated weeks later. It could explain why the hikers cut their way out in urgency. It could even explain how some injuries were caused by snow impact and collapse pressure rather than a direct attack. But even the researchers were careful. They did not claim to have solved every detail forever. They argued that the slab avalanche mechanism made the event plausible in a way earlier critics had not accounted for. That is a big difference. Plausible is not the same word as proven. So what is the most grounded reconstruction? A small slab of snow or the fear of one compromises the tent after a delay? The group gets out fast, underdressed, and moves downhill toward the forest because the open slope feels exposed and unsafe. At the tree line, they try to survive, split tasks, light a fire, and decide whether returning to the tent is still possible. 2 men remain near the cedar and the fire. 3 attempt the uphill return and die on the way. 4 others work farther down in the ravine area, perhaps to build better shelter, and some of them suffer the severe injuries that make the case feel almost impossible. In that version of events, the mystery is not a monster. It is a chain of survival decisions collapsing under Arctic conditions. And yet, even now, something remains deeply unsettling. We do not know the exact sequence minute by minute. We do not know the exact trigger with absolute certainty. We do not know what each person believed was happening in that darkness. The final terror of Dyatlov Pass may be that the best explanation still leaves room for silence. Because that is what this case really is, not a perfect puzzle waiting for one dramatic answer, but a human tragedy preserved in fragments. A torn tent. A fire under a cedar. 9 names in the snow. What do you think happened on that mountain, and which detail still troubles you most? Subscribe for the next Mystery Files investigation.